Halloween, All Hallows Eve, Night of the Witches, Samhain, whatever you want to call it, it's one of those inescapable holidays that comes every year. The day where children go from house to house dressed as monsters or whatever other horror characters they can think of and ask strangers for candy. It's also the time of year where people hollow out pumpkins and put candles inside and put them outside their house. But all of the horror surrounding Halloween is just make-believe, right? It's not real. Well, like any other day, real-life horror doesn't take a day off for Halloween. And while everyone else is playing pretend, some people use the holiday as a chance to commit some truly disturbing and gruesome murders. So, as it's the season, I've decided to list 6 of them. Here are 6 of the most gruesome Halloween murders. On Halloween 2004, roommates Adriana Sona, Leslie Mazzara, and Lauren Mianza had decided to call it a night after they had finished handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. It was not long after 11 p.m. when the 3 26-year-old women who shared a house on Dorset Street in Napa Valley, California, headed for bed. Lauren, who had the only bedroom on the first floor, was woken by strange noises coming from upstairs. She crept out of her room quietly and slowly, trying to figure out from where she was hearing the noise. She then heard what she later described as a blood-curdling, terrified scream and the sound of breaking glass. Suddenly, she could hear footsteps thundering down the stairs. Lauren ran from the house using the back door, hiding in the backyard. She stayed hidden, afraid that she was trapped and that whoever was in the house was coming for her next. She heard the intruder climbing out of the same window he entered through, before running off into the night. Lauren ran back into the house when she felt safe enough to do so. She headed to her friend's bedrooms upstairs and found Leslie Mazzara face down in the doorway of her bedroom. Lauren then found Adrian, crouched behind Leslie's bed and alive, but bleeding profusely from multiple stab wounds. Lauren tried to use the landline to dial 911, but found the connection was dead. She raced for her cell phone, fleeing the house and driving away in her car, fearing she might still be in danger. When police and emergency services arrived on the scene, Leslie Mazzara was officially pronounced dead, but Adriana Sona was still clinging to life. Paramedics started to work on stabilizing her on the road to the hospital, but Adrian died before they got there. Both women had been stabbed multiple times. Lauren told the police what she heard, but wasn't able to give a description of the killer because she had been hiding, too scared to look as the man left the house. After the murders, police and forensic investigators painstakingly combed the scene for evidence, and for the next 11 months, they interviewed over 1,300 people and collected 218 DNA samples, determined to solve the crime. On September 22, 2005, police released a statement saying they had a match on blood DNA evidence from the scene to cigarette butts found outside. Furthermore, the cigarette brand was very unusual, Camel Turkish Gold. To the surprise of the police, only days later, on September 27th, Eric Koppel, the now husband of Adrian's friend Lily Prudhomme, turned himself in for the murders of Leslie Mazzara and Adriana Sona. Fearing his capture was only a matter of time after the police released the information about DNA in the cigarettes, Koppel confessed to his family and his new wife, who convinced him that he needed to turn himself in immediately. No motive has ever been officially released for the murders, with Koppel himself unable to justify or explain his actions. He told the police during interviews that he could barely remember what happened. However, the most likely theory believed by authorities is that Koppel felt threatened by Lily's close friendship with Adriana Sona, that perhaps he feared Lily spending time with Adrian would interfere in his relationship with his future wife. Adrian, police believe, died as she went to Mazzara's rescue after hearing her friend's screams. She scratched and hit Eric, which left his blood at the scene to be matched to the cigarette butts before he overpowered her. Eric Koppel was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and pleaded guilty to both, foregoing a trial. After discussions with the victims' families, Koppel's attorneys, and the prosecution, an agreement was reached that Koppel would spend the rest of his life in prison, with no possibility for parole. In exchange for Eric not facing the death penalty, he also waived his right to appeal and his right to talk about the case to anyone except members of a clergy, meaning media interviews are not allowed, and we may never get to hear just what his motive was, should he ever realize one. At his sentencing hearing, Leslie Mazzara's mother, Kathy Harrington, told Koppel, "For the rest of your life, you and your family will experience what both your victims and loved ones have felt: terror, desperation, hopelessness, violence. I wish I could tell you that I forgive you. At this time, I cannot. And finally, I pray that never again will any mother's child grow up to be a murderer. On Halloween 2010 in Sandusky, Ohio, 16-year-old Devon Lisk returned home from Sunday choir practice at 1:30 p.m. Devon had decided he wanted to unwind after a long morning and went to go and play video games in his room. He noticed that the house was quiet, more than usual, as his family was usually awake by now. He knew his mother, Susan Lisk, was usually wide awake and doing something around the house. Devon decided to go and look around the house to locate his family. When he entered the master bedroom, he found his mother and stepfather, William E. Lisk, lying in bed with their maroon comforter pulled over their heads. Hoping to wake them, Devon began casually talking to them as he walked around to his mother's side of the bed. It was then that he noticed her foot had been sticking out from under the covers. Tapping on her leg to get her attention, she still gave no response. He pulled down the covers to reveal a bloody mess soaked into her pillow. Running from the house in tears, he realized his family had been murdered. Calling his aunt for help, she arrived and called for 911. Detectives found William and Susan shot to death in their bed. According to the coroner, William Lisk was shot 5 times in the head and face. Susan had been violated and then shot 3 times at close range. Devon's brother Derek had a room upstairs, which was locked upon the arrival of the police. The police kicked in the door and found the young man curled up in bed facing the wall. The coroners estimated his death as a result of blunt force trauma and most likely died within minutes of the first blow. Investigators had found a bloody claw hammer in the house, as well as muddy footprints near the family's pond on the deck, leading the police to believe this is where the other weapon had been disposed of. The pond was drained, resulting in no weapon. William B.J. Lisk Jr., the son of William Lisk, was immediately identified as a suspect. He was charged with 1 count of murder right at the time of the arrest. This allowed them to hold Lisk Jr. until the case was presented to the grand jury. Devon had spent the previous night at his biological father's house and returned to his mother's house that morning to change into his church clothes. He recalled seeing his stepbrother William Jr. at the house that morning, but ultimately thought nothing of it. Looking into William Jr.'s records, it was found that he was quite a troubled young man. In October of 2004, he had gotten into a fight with his stepmother and struck her hard in the chest. He was charged with felonious assault and robbery 2 months later for stealing Susan Lisk's car keys after hitting her with a coffee mug. There were at least 3 recorded encounters with the police after William had been moved into a Sandusky group home for mental health patients, including a physical fight between him and his father. The week before the murders, William Lisk had taken some vacation time and decided to take his son deer hunting. They returned home from the trip less than 24 hours before the murders took place. Neighbors felt weary of William Jr. and often suspected him of killing and torturing neighborhood pets. After they returned from the hunting trip, William Sr. and William Jr. got together with friends for a few beers. William Sr. allowed for his son to spend the night as they had both been drinking and did not find it safe for William Jr. to drive back to Sandusky. The next morning was when William Jr. murdered the family. William Jr. pled guilty in 2011 to 3 counts of aggravated murder. In exchange for his plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty and instead recommended William be sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, on March 31st, 2015, William Jr. was found dead in his cell from what the police have described as a self-inflicted injury. On Halloween 2011, 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest left her home in Armstrong, British Columbia, Canada, dressed as a zombie for Halloween. With plans to meet friends and enjoy a fun night of trick-or-treating, her walk alongside the railway track in the small farming town around 6 p.m. that evening took her through a secluded area. In the dark, with no one around her, she sent a text to her friend that she was, quote, being creeped. It was the last message received from her before she was brutally attacked, being left on the ground to die as her attacker ran off into the night. She was found almost 3 hours later laying face down and barely alive. Taylor was rushed to the hospital with her friends and family following behind, but died soon after without ever regaining consciousness. After the death of Taylor, an autopsy revealed that she had suffered 6 separate injuries to her head, causing her skull to fracture, along with clear evidence of strangulation on her throat. Taylor had tried to fight off her attacker, leaving marks on her neck from her own nails, desperately trying to remove the ligature she was being strangled with. Local residents heard her screams at the time of the murder, but being Halloween night, did not think anything of them or investigate them further. Pathologists were unable to determine whether she had been hit over the head or strangled first, but there was no doubt that she suffered a terrifying ordeal in those minutes before she lost consciousness. Taylor scratched her attacker, obtaining his DNA under her fingernails. It was this evidence that was used to find and eventually convict the man who was responsible for her horrific death. That man was Matthew Forster, a 26-year-old man who had come into the small town looking for sex that night, before fleeing the area and going into hiding after the attack. He was arrested for the murder in April 2012 in a motel room in Ontario. Forster's admittance of being responsible for her injuries meant the question for the jury was whether his actions amounted to first-degree murder or manslaughter. His DNA was found under Taylor's fingernails, and her DNA was found inside his truck. Matthew Forster's father, 60-year-old Stephen Forster, was also arrested in relation to this murder, charged as an accessory to murder after evidence uncovered by the police proved that he had lied for his son. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison after his son's conviction for helping his son evade capture by the police. His conviction came after it was revealed that in the 3 months after the murder, he left his job, paid money for a driving license, social insurance number, and a bank card for his son, and lied to the police, telling them his son was away working on oil rigs, when in truth, he was hiding out in Ontario. The father and son communicated on disposable cell phones to avoid being recorded or traced. In late March and early April 2012, the police were recording their communications and heard him tell his son not to come home, as police surveillance was in place and he needed to lay low. In May 2014, Matthew Forster was found guilty of first-degree murder, which carries a mandatory life sentence in Canada with no chance of parole for a minimum of 25 years. Marie Van Diest, Taylor's mother, said after the verdict, "The fact that he chose not to speak speaks volumes in how cowardly, dysfunctional, and deviant this individual is." Marvin and Ethel Brandt of Fort Dodge, Iowa, had been married for over 40 years. They owned a carpentry business in the local community, and the couple were well liked among their neighbors, with Marvin also being revered as a war hero, having served in World War II. They also enjoyed taking part in the Halloween traditions and would hand out candy to the trick-or-treaters who would come to their door each year. On October 30th, 1982, Teresa Trueblood, the couple's granddaughter, had just left after visiting with her grandparents. When she left, they were giving out candy to trick-or-treaters. Soon after Teresa had left, there was a knock at the door. Ethel opened the door, assuming it was a trick-or-treater, but was instead faced with a grown man wearing a pillowcase with eye holes on his head. He said, "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot." Ethel thought this was a prank and tried to remove the man's pillowcase. He clutched it and pulled it down. As Ethel went to get candy, the stranger followed her into the house and pulled a gun on her and Marvin. Somehow he knew the family had a safe in the basement. This was something only family members knew. He ordered the couple into the basement. He wanted what was inside the safe. Marvin had no intention of going into the basement. He had become tired of what he thought was a Halloween prank. After trying to grab the gun from the masked man, the robber pulled the trigger. A bullet struck Marvin in his throat. The shooter then ripped off the pillowcase, threw it down, and slipped away. Marvin was rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, he died from his injuries on October 31st, 1982, while on the operating table. Marvin and Ethel's granddaughter, Teresa Trueblood, said Ethel eventually died from a broken heart on July 20th, 1983. Teresa has said she regrets about what happened to her grandparents. After leaving her grandparents' home on that fateful day, she thought about returning immediately. She wanted to tell them not to answer the door after 7:30 p.m., but she had no idea of the tragedy that would later unfold. Fortunately, Ethel was able to describe the shooter. She said he stood about 5'8", with blonde hair and blue eyes, and she estimated that he was somewhere between 16 and 20. The family has claimed that they know the killer's identity. He was a family acquaintance who was allegedly bragged about killing Marvin Brandt. Although the family has given the alleged shooter's name to the Fort Dodge police, they have arrested no one. Years later, a crime lab analyzed the pillowcase for DNA, but with no success. Based on comments made by the Fort Dodge Police Department, they don't want to take the suspect to court unless they can secure a conviction. Ethel Brandt was the only person who could identify the shooter, but she has been dead for well over 35 years. The family had hoped for some closure, and Teresa called the findings, quote, a real big letdown. The family have said that they plan to keep pushing for an arrest, even though they're afraid the killer may come after them. Derek Ward was a very mentally disturbed individual. At 35 years old, he had battled mental health issues for over a decade. He'd spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric facility after suffering a breakdown following the death of his grandfather, sometimes claimed he could hear voices, witnessed his brother Robert's death due to a heroin overdose in 1997, and had once been arrested for gun possession and criminal mischief. Due to his issues, he was unable to look after himself and lived with his mother Patricia Ward. On top of his mental health issues, Derek also suffered from ADD and dyslexia, and apparently couldn't read for much of his life, with Patricia, a language teacher at Farmingdale State College, teaching him how to read. Despite all of his problems, Derek had never once shown any aggression to his mother, whom by all accounts he was very close to. Things took a dark turn in October of 2014, however. Due to financial difficulties, Patricia was not able to afford to pay for Derek's appointments with his psychiatrist, which would cost $200 for a 20-minute session. On top of this, Patricia was also unable to get the medication that was prescribed to Derek after his time in the mental health facility. This caused Derek to become very irritable and aggressive. He apparently screamed at her just for dropping a fork on the floor, claiming the noise hurt his ears. Patricia pleaded with him to go to the emergency room to get some medicine, but he refused. At this point, Patricia's family urged her to call the police, as they were worried what Derek would do next. She didn't contact the police, however, as while he was becoming increasingly volatile, Derek still never raised a hand to his mother. Derek was too old to be covered by Patricia's health insurance, and she was unable to find any psychiatrists willing to make an exception due to her circumstances. However, she eventually did manage to find one who was compassionate towards her situation and offered to see Derek for a session as well as provide some medication for him on Friday, October 31st. Unfortunately, Derek would not make it to this appointment. On Tuesday, October 28th, neighbors noticed something on the ground across from Patricia and Derek's apartment building. Upon looking closer, they noticed that it seemed to resemble a human head with long black hair. At first, they thought it must be some kind of Halloween decoration. Across the street, they saw what they assumed to be another decoration, this time resembling a human body, which also happened to be headless. Of course, when the people took a closer look at these decorations, they discovered that what they were looking at was the body and severed head of Patricia Ward. Derek had stabbed his mother to death before decapitating her with the same knife he'd used to kill her with. He then kicked the head out of the building while dragging her body and kicked it across the street before dumping her body outside and fleeing the scene. The police were called to the scene, but by this time, Derek was already dead. He jumped in front of an oncoming train around half an hour after the murder. It would seem Derek had a complete psychotic mental breakdown from not being able to have his medication, and in his manic state, brutally murdered his mother, before briefly regaining control of his mind. Realizing what he'd done to his mother, Derek was most likely overcome with guilt and took his own life in a fit of grief. Patricia did everything she could to get her son the help he needed, but in the end, she was too late, and paid the price in the most gruesome way imaginable. I suppose I really couldn't make a video about Halloween murders without discussing the case of Ronald Clark OBrien, for his story is probably the most infamous of any Halloween murder, and is usually the first one most people think of. This makes sense, as the horrifying act that Ronald committed on that Halloween night in 1974 still haunts America to this day, and has made him one of the most despised killers in history. No information seems to exist about OBrien's early life, other than the fact that he was born on October 19, 1944. He lived with his wife Deneen in Deer Park, Texas. They had 2 children, Timothy, born in 1966, and Elizabeth, born in 1969. Ronald worked as an optician at the Texas State Optical in Sharpstown, Houston. He was also a deacon for the Second Baptist Church and sang in the choir and was in charge of the local bus program. On October 2, 1974, Ronald phoned a friend in the insurance business and asked about insuring his 2 children. The insurance agent didn't know it, but Ronald had already insured the children through a savings plan at his bank. The plan provided a $10,000 accidental death policy for the head of the household who had a checking account with the bank. The premium was $3 per month. Additional family members authorized to use the account could also be insured for an extra $1 each. When Ronald sought the additional $20,000 insurance for each of his children, the agent tried to steer him toward a college savings plan that would allow the children to cash in the policy to use the money for their education. Ronald insisted on the traditional accidental death insurance policies despite the higher premiums. He also raised red flags when he insisted on paying for those particular policies with cash, rather than by check as he did for other policies. At the same time he was insuring the children, he was also seeking the weapon for their deaths. Through his work, Ronald knew that cyanide had been used to polish gold frames, but the technique had been replaced by safer methods in the last decade or so. He spoke to several people about purchasing cyanide, telling co-workers that he was interested in learning the old polishing method. Ronald spoke to at least 12 people about cyanide, including asking one chemist friend about the amount of cyanide needed to kill a person. On Halloween 1974, Ronald and another parent took Timothy, Elizabeth, and 2 other children trick-or-treating in Pasadena, Texas. Upon visiting a particular house where there did not appear to be anyone home, the group moved on. Ronald stayed behind in case somebody answered the door. He quickly caught back up with them, holding 5 pixie sticks. According to him, the homeowner was simply taking their time to respond. He gave 1 pixie stick each to the children before giving the final one to a child who was not part of the group. When it began to rain, the trick-or-treating was cut short, and the group headed back to their homes. Before bed, Timothy asked if he could eat some of his candy. His parents agreed, and he started with the pixie sticks. Not long afterwards, he complained that the candy tasted unusually bitter. OBrien helped his son wash away the taste by giving him Kool-Aid. Timothy, who by this point was having stomach pains, ran to the bathroom where he started vomiting and convulsing. He went limp in his father's arms and died on the way to the hospital. Timothy had consumed enough poison to have killed 2 adults. Fortunately, Elizabeth and the other 3 children had not eaten their pixie sticks. Timothy's murder prompted uproar in the community, with numerous parents bringing their children's Halloween candy to the police in fear that it may be poisoned. It seemed as if a stranger had been handing out poison candy with the sole intention of killing as many children as possible. This was initially believed by the police, but it did not take long for suspicion to fall upon Ronald. He could not remember which house he got the pixie sticks from, despite the fact that the group had only visited a few homes across 2 streets before it started raining. It eventually turned out that Ronald was over $100,000 in debt, and had taken out $60,000 worth of life insurance on his children. His plan was to fatally poison Timothy and Elizabeth to collect their life insurance and ease his financial woes. He gave the spare pixie sticks to the 3 other children in an attempt to cover up his tracks. He was arrested on November 5, 1974. Ronald maintained his innocence during his trial, but the evidence against him was too overwhelming to ignore. On June 3, 1975, Ronald was found guilty of his son's death, as well as 4 counts of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to death. While on death row, he was despised by his fellow inmates, who condemned him for killing his own child. On March 31, 1984, just after midnight, Ronald was executed by lethal injection. Before his execution, he continued to insist that he was innocent of any wrongdoing. A crowd of demonstrators gathered outside as he died, with some mockingly shouting, "Trick or treat." And that's the end of the video, folks. I don't know how I managed to get this video out in time for Halloween, considering how bad my uploading schedule is, but here it is, and I hope you enjoyed it. Whatever you have planned for Halloween, I hope you enjoy yourself. As for me, I'll probably watch a movie or something, or maybe play a few games. Yeah, my Halloweens are usually pretty uneventful. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go put cardboard cutouts of Jimmy Savile, Ian Watkins, Gary Glitter, and R. Kelly outside my house to scare away the trick-or-treaters. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to like the video, comment, and subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.